Raymond Mays was developing the ERA. He rang my mother and said, would you like to come over and try out the prototype ERA? Well, she said to me, with the vibration, I suppose it's possible you might have been born in an ERA.
I thought he'd made the car in secret.
The wheel came off and he ended up in a sweet shop. All he could remember was chocolates, toffees, cascading down on him. So he joined up on day one of World War I. Within 3 weeks, he was in the trenches. But then snipers began to have a go at him. But then he met the German ace. He crashed and was in hospital for 10 months.
Welcome to Vintage Velocity, the podcast from the Vintage Sports Car Club, where we look at the people, the passion and the cars. This episode, I chat to Victor Riley, who with his extraordinary memory tells me about how the Riley sports car came to being, his mother Dorothy racing at Le Mans, and the remarkable exploits of his uncle Cecil. Oh, and how he almost was born in an ERA whilst his mother was testing it. I do hope you enjoy listening to Victor as much as I did. I'm Lara Plattman with the Vintage Sports Car Club.
Welcome to what I hope will be the first of many podcasts with the Vintage Sports Car Club. And I'm here with Victor Riley at the Riley Trust Archive in the Canal Basin. Hello.
Hello.
So I first approached you, Victor, because I wanted to talk about your mother. But seeing as we're here at the Basin, we need to go back right to the beginning of how Riley started. With your grandfather, we need to go right back to the 10th century, the last century, or before the last century, and just start to talk about that. But before we do, I want to just explain for those who are listening and not viewing at the same time. We're in the Riley Trust Archive, and there's photographs and boards all over the walls. We've got a car and a bicycle. We're right beside the canal, and this is where you're open to the public by appointment, and everyone can come and look at the Riley Trust and understand and learn more about the Riley Trust. So without further ado, Victor, start from the beginning with your grandfather.
Well, grandfather, who was known as William Riley Jr., was born in 1851, and his father was William Riley Sr., who'd been born in 1826. And grandfather must have had some ability that so impressed his father that in 1870 he decided he'd step aside and let his son take over the business. This was a weaving business, and ribbon weaving and ribbon trimming in particular. He, Senior, then proceeded to live into his 80s, and I've often wondered how he got away with it, pleading ill health. But anyway, he was probably right. Junior admittedly had a wonderfully fortunate start, because in 1870 the Franco-Prussian War started. We had 2 or 3 years with no continental imports, and to use the expression, he made hay while the sun shone, because continental imports were undercutting Coventry craftsmen who worked in their own houses and took great pride in their skills, whereas the Continentals were in a form of mass production and so could undercut the Coventry craftsmen. So William got underway, and he was operating only 100 yards from where we are today. His house where he lives still stands, and the couple in it often volunteer, and so that makes it all neat and tidy. But grandfather, William Riley Jr., could see that the decline in ribbon weaving and weaving were definitely coming. There was nothing they could do to stop the imports, which resumed a few years after the Franco-Prussian War. And William Riley one day said to his neighbour, who happened to be Henry Snr, the first editor of the Autocar magazine, which was launched in 1895.
Huh.
I've got 5 sons. What do I do? Weaving's in decline. And Henry Snr, who is another famous Coventry name with the Snr Archer 3-wheel, three gears on the bicycle transmission, he said, get into bicycles. There is the biggest boom coming. Coventry's seen nothing like it. Everyone will want to ride a bicycle. And so William Riley then pulled my father out of school at 12 years old and put him in a bicycle factory to learn how to make a bicycle as quickly as he could. That company happened to be Bonnick's in King Street, again, just a stone's throw from here. Then Bonnick's got into serious financial difficulties. They had an order from America for 3,000 bicycles, which they delivered, but they couldn't get their money for them. Even though they won a court case in America identifying the debt, they still couldn't get the money. So William saw the opportunity to take them over at a knockdown price. And so we had Bonnick's in King Street, Riley's in St. Nicholas Street, and
St. Nicholas Street is literally, it's
Yeah.
physically at the end of this lane.
exactly.
Oh my God.
Yeah, yes. So we are now back where our roots are,
Wow.
and which is fascinating, really, especially as we've started school visits. We've had primary schools come to us from Coventry, where we've given them a chat, let them sit on the replica of the 1896, 1898 Riley, look at the Riley bicycle made in 1903, just 100 yards from here.
For those not looking and listening in their ears, we're just pointing to the cars, the car and the bicycle that's hanging on the wall. But carry on.
So production got underway, increased, and in 1896, William Riley Jr. formed the Riley Cycle Company Limited, and his brother Herbert was a director with him, and Basil Riley became a director. Now, Basil Riley's got an interesting story. His parents were born in Ireland. They emigrated to Liverpool, went up to Manchester, where they brought a baby girl with them. They had 5 more children, one of whom was Basil. Basil, after the Manchester anti-Irish riots, came south to Coventry, became an expert tailor, and scooped the contract to make all the bicycle gear that cyclists were going to wear, like the cap, the jacket, the gloves, the breeches, and made a fortune. Married William Riley Jr.'s younger sister, Hannah, and became, with all that capital, brought it into the business and was made chairman. We have now in the archive the minute book from 1896 to the First World War, and that's being looked at prior to digitization, because we are digitizing a lot of material here.
Perfect.
And
So we're moving on from 1896, when he started the cycle company, and 2 years later, your uncle Percy secretly built a motor car.
Yeah.
I mean, how did that happen all in 2 years? Where did Percy get his engineering skills from?
Percy was born in 1880. Once he was 11, 12, 13, he and my father would go down to Coventry Library every evening. Quite a contrast to these days. It was open till 9 at night, and they would read everything they could get their hands on about Benz and what he was doing in Germany. Then came the evening when Percy turned to my father and said, I could make a car. I'm sure I could. And my father said, well, get on and do it. He said, but I'm not old enough to buy materials. Well, I am. So you tell me what you want and I'll purchase the materials for you.
Because I thought he'd made the car in secret.
Well, we now move on to work getting underway. He was still at school, very good at maths, and his father paid for him to stay on at school just for maths only, to develop the maths to a high level. They then went to their father about sort of backing this project, and their father said to them, forget it. I don't want a smelly, dirty engine in our home, in our works. We've got the pony and trap. We've got the bicycle. We don't need anything else.
So this was William Senior or
Junior.
William Junior? So it was their father.
Yes.
He said, we don't want any of this.
Yeah.
And he put him through school to learn more maths. And
Yes.
so he was saying, learn and, be studious, but yet you can't build a car.
Yeah. But you see, Percy was already developing the bicycle and patenting. So his father could see the value already of maths. But the amazing thing is, Percy never went to university, got a degree. He was totally self-taught, plus the maths teacher at King Henry VIII School in Coventry, where he was a student. It is an incredible story of incredible ability coming to light. So anyway, they get underway making the 1896-1898 car. Percy, worried about his father's attitude, had sub-assemblies hidden away in various parts of the bicycle works. And then came the day when he put it all together. 2 years after starting in 1898, he finished the car. He then said to my father, well, we've got this car now, what do we do? And my father, who by then was cycling champion of Coventry, riding a Riley bicycle, said, we go to Stratford-upon-Avon, which was a famous run, Coventry to Stratford, and lots of bicycle races on that. We go to Stratford and back quicker than a bicycle. And that's how we prove this. Well, they did that journey, no breakdowns, then back to their father saying, let's make cars, not bicycles. Look what we've got. And their father still wouldn't relent. He said, no, I don't want anything to do with it. And it's a smelly, dirty machine. Now, a lot of people in Coventry reckoned that their father, had the smartest pony and trap livery in Coventry. And he didn't want anything to supersede that. Whether that's true or not, we'll never know. So father said no. So they go to their mother, who had £39 in a post office savings account, which was a lot of money in those days. She pulled the money out, gave it to father and Alan, who was the second son, and Percy, the third son, and they got a shed in the lee of Cook Street Gate, which somewhere on one of these walls is, I think it's over there in the top left-hand corner. And father and Alan stayed working for their father, getting weekly wages, siphoning off some of that money to give to Percy to fund him, because he had no income. And then a few months later, he's into engine production, comes knocking on his father's door and said, why don't you put my engine on your bicycle? And then you've got a motor bicycle.
Oh la la.
grandfather, faced with his wife, 5 sons, had to give way. And so the Riley Motorbike, as it was known, was born. And that had quite a few successes in races. But then Percy added a third wheel, bringing about the tricar.
Yes.
Then my father took the tricar all over the country, hill climbs, promenade sprints, and had enormous success with it, winning medals galore. But then one day, descending the hill into Rugeley, a wheel came off and he ended up in a sweet shop. And before he became unconscious, all he can remember was chocolates, toffees, cascading down on him. When he comes to,
Fortunate.
the lady owning it had made him a cup of tea. And so he got a £5 note out of his wallet, gave it to her, but she refused. And then Percy realised that he'd got to add a fourth wheel. He said, Vic, I must do it because you're going to kill yourself on 3 wheels. You're going too fast, way beyond what I designed. So the fourth wheel was added, and then we had these V-twins in 1905, 6, 7.
So before that, did he invent the first mechanically operated inlet valve, which Benz thought they had? Is that something that Percy had done, or had Benz done that?
There is a lot of research currently going on this subject.
Okay.
Riley law has it that Percy invented the mechanically operated inlet valve. It's becoming fairly certain that he didn't. It was invented a few months earlier or so on. But Percy did make use of it in the first car, because this Riley was the second car on the streets of Coventry after Daimler. And then when Benz thought they had a patent on the mechanically operated inlet valve, and they tried to sue Riley's, Percy pointed to the fact he used it 2 years earlier. So Benz's court case fell through, and Percy inadvertently saved the British car industry thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds in royalties.
Wow. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely mad.
So we've spoken about the inlet valve with Riley and Benz sort of having discrepancies. But in 1907, your grandfather, decided to focus on automobiles after all. And how did he decide that he really ought to get into automobiles after, reluctantly not wanting to get involved with them to start with?
Really, he was propelled along by his sons, because there was another factor. He was in bicycle production, and that carried on to 1908. At the works in the lee of Cook Street Gate, Percy was then starting on car production with the V-twin 1906, where there are only 3 left in the world, and we're hoping to have one in the Riley archive next year. So really, grandfather was, if you like, ensconced in a sort of environment where he was just being swept along. There then came another development. Percy Riley then invented the detachable wire wheel.
Yes.
Grandfather was so taken by that, he turned the works over to detachable wire wheels. And a few years later, when they were supplying 183 companies all over the world with detachable wire wheels, he said to his sons, I can make more money from detachable wire wheels than from cars. Therefore, I'm going to cease car production and he'd only barely started. And the sons were devastated. So they then got another unit in Widdrington Avenue, not far from here, where they started car production. And so grandfather was in detachable wheel production, and they were in car production. And then came World War One.
Then came World War One,
yeah.
and they were instrumental in making engines for aeroplanes, right?
Well, Percy probably started too late in the war. And it is true, he designed one, went to the ministry, but by that time, World War One was well over halfway. The ministry had got other engines in production, so Percy's engine never really saw the light of day. But he did a lot of work on it and supplied a prototype, but it was too late in the war to make any impact.
And what about, was it Alan who made the Nero engine?
Stanley made the Nero engine.
Stanley?
Son number 4,
Ah.
who was to become the chassis and body designer.
Ah.
And we found an exercise book from when he was at school, and in the back of it are all his doodlings on car design. And the car that was to shake the world, the Monaco in 1928, in the back of the exercise book is a car very similar to what many years later he brought out. He was another one of these visionary genii, really.
So what was the Nero engine then?
Well, the Nero engine was an engine that Stanley designed. He made a prototype and was starting production when World War One came, and so that stopped. But what my father did in World War One, he closed the Nero engine works in Spon Street in Coventry and went to the ministry, probably the War Department, and they gave him a factory on the outskirts of Coventry in Foleshill, Durbar Avenue. And so he moved the Nero works out there, and the ministry did that, providing he made munitions for the war. But it meant that at the end of World War One, he had a modern factory, whereas all they'd got was this old cycle works in Nicholas Street, which was in a very dilapidated state. And so it really opened the way for car production in a much bigger scale.
So after the war, all of the different Riley companies amalgamated?
Well, no. Percy's engine company, Snr, carried on and was also in Widdrington Avenue. Alan then took another factory almost next door to his brother Percy, and he called it Midland Motor Bodies,
Yeah.
and he supplied all the bodies for Riley's. Stanley became chassis and body designer, and that left the youngest son, William Thomas Cecil Riley, and he always used to tell me as a boy, I felt a little bit miffed because when I left school, my 4 elder brothers had taken all the top jobs. There was nothing left for me. So he joined up on day 1 of World War One. Within 2-3 weeks, in August 1914, he was in the trenches. And I wonder what sort of training there was time to give him that period. He then decided he didn't like trench warfare, and when they asked for volunteers for motorbike riders, he volunteered, thinking he'd be safer on a motorbike going up and down the lines with messages.
Was he?
But then snipers began to have a go at him, and so when the Royal Flying Corps was formed later in the war, which was the predecessor to the RAF, he volunteered, thinking up in the sky he would be safe. But then he met the German ace one day,
Yeah.
who was in the habit of shooting down Allied planes. William Thomas Cecil, whom we knew as Uncle Tet, he crashed and was in hospital for 10 months as they put him together again. And grandfather and father went to see him every day.
And he survived the First World War.
He survived
Oh
the
my
First World
goodness!
War.
My goodness, that's good.
And then joined up on day one
Oh,
of the Second World War.
no.
When my father said, "Look, you've done your bit. What on earth are you doing?" And he said, "No, I'm a patriot. I'm going back to war." But he managed to survive
He
World
did.
War II.
Oh, good. Oh my
Yeah,
goodness.
yeah,
Oh my
yeah,
goodness.
Yeah, yeah.
Amazing,
yeah,
amazing.
Yeah.
So going back
Yeah,
to something that's
yeah,
not
yeah,
war,
yeah.
in 1926,
Yeah.
Percy's groundbreaking Riley 9 was
Yeah.
produced,
Yeah.
and the fabric body with the fabric body saloon.
Yeah.
So can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yes. Percy and Stanley started work on it in around 1924. In 1925, they invited their father to come and have a look at the prototype. Grandfather took one look at it, waved his walking stick at it, said, "What on earth have you wasted my time for? This is a toy car. It'll never sell. You're mad." So the prototype lay in the corner of one of the shops up at Durbar Avenue for 12 to 18 months. And I think this is absolutely terrible, because it meant this world-shattering car could have been out far earlier. They always worked Saturday mornings, and the Riley Motor Club was formed in 1925 at the end of one of the London-Edinburgh runs, when the Rileys that had made it, the directors always went up on the final night, and anyone who got to Edinburgh got a gold star they invited to dinner. At the conclusion of the 1925 dinner, someone got up and proposed the formation of the Riley Motor Club. That was passed. And so in 1926, they'd had 3 events, and the 4th event was going to be at Cheddar Gorge. So Stanley, Saturday morning, said to my father, "This is the 4th meeting of the Riley Motor Club. I want to go. What shall I take?" And my father said, "Take the Riley 9.
Wow.
And Stanley said, "Vic, what's the point? You know Father's rubbished it and said it's no use. Do as I say, Stanley. Take the 9. Now, when I was a boy, Stanley said to me, "I can't be certain, but when your father walked away from me, I thought I detected in just an instant a slight smile. And I did say to myself, Vic's up to something, but I don't know what. I can't make head nor tail of it." Anyway, I was told, took the 9, arrived in Cheddar Gorge early afternoon, and parked it in the far corner of the field, because I was a bit embarrassed. I didn't want anyone to see it. But Wally Radcliffe, of Radcliffe, the Riley car dealers in Croydon, he spotted me. He came galloping over the field and saying, "Stanley, what have you got there?" Stanley said, "Oh, it's nothing. It's not." "Don't tell me it's nothing. Take me up the gorge." So we just flew up the gorge. Well, Wally got out of the car and ran back and said, "Come and look at this. Incredible. This must be a new Riley." Because a lot of the dealers in those days supported the Riley Motor Club as a means of increasing sales and encouraging more members to join and so on. So they were all gathered round it. Monday morning, my father's phone never stopped ringing. And he then walked along the corridor to his father and said, "This toy car, I think you need to call a board meeting very quickly. We've hit the jackpot, I'm certain." So, and they outvoted grandfather, I think 3-2 in a director's vote, to get into production, because the orders were just pouring in. they were just overwhelmed. It took 2 to 3 years before they could get production up to meet the incoming flow of orders. And the ploy of my father, Stanley said to me, it worked. And he said, I'm sure now there was a smile on his face. He knew what he was up to.
Very, very cheeky.
Yeah.
So Percy developed the Riley 9.
Yeah.
And part of me was thinking that Mike Hawthorne raced that, but was that in the 50s? What happened between Percy's Riley 9 and the 50s? There was some racing that went on, and there's a big story about that.
Yes, the Thompson and Taylor had a little design office and workshop on the edge of the Brooklands track. They approached my father very quickly after the launch and said, this engine you've got, we can exploit it far beyond where Percy's got it. And my father said, okay, go ahead. So they developed the engine, and Reed Railton built a prototype Brooklands model, and that was the name they gave it as they were on the edge of the Brooklands track, entered it in a race and won by a mile. This tiny little engine. My father was very worried because he made it look as if the handicapper was made to look a fool. But they became good friends, and the handicapper never took it out on Riley's, even though he was very embarrassed. But that car, then they moved production up to Riley's from Thompson and Taylor, and they started to enter a team of 3 in Brooklands races. We then got a lovely story. Ken Peacock, who was in the team, was in the lead in a race at Brooklands when the driving mechanic, which you had to have in those days, said he could hear a noise. They decided it was the number plate loose. So they were leading their class. Do they come in, get it fixed but lose the lead, then hope to regain it? Or do they do nothing, win the class, but then get disqualified by the scrutineering after the race? Then the mechanic inches his way down the bonnet of the Brooklands with Ken Peacock's left hand holding his ankle, his right hand on the steering wheel, and the mechanic fixes it, inches his way back up the bonnet.
As they were racing?
As they were racing.
Oh, yeah.
And they win their class.
Amazing.
One of the best stories I've heard.
Oh my goodness.
But then they go on, and then of course they win a TT. They won 3 TTs in the 30s. Only Jaguar have equalled that number.
So talking about Jaguar, their emergence in Coventry was quite paramount to the Riley road car.
Yes.
And that's where sort of the Riley car sort of was lesser on the road towards rather than the racetrack. Is that right?
Well, when Nuffield took over in 1938, promising my father a financial umbrella, but leaving him free to concentrate on design, production, marketing, but he wanted racing to end. And so you had then the privateers carry on, so they kept the Riley name on the track, but it wasn't, the company would help them with advice and so on, but they didn't have an official works team like they'd had all through the 30s up to that date. Yeah.
So this brings me to something I'm really, really interested in, is your mother, Dorothy. And she raced Riley's. So she raced, she raced in her early 20s, but she raced in sort of 1932, didn't she?
She started...
How did she get into racing? Where did all that come from?
1928, when she'd been born in 1909, so she was 19, just leaving school, and there was a big rally, Riley Motor Club rally up in Scarborough. And my mother's godparents had a Riley. So they took her along to this Riley Motor Club rally in Scarborough. And of course, she was a Scarborough family. She'd been born in Scarborough. They took her up and introduced her to my father. A year later, her uncle died and left her £1,000. But he specified that she either had to become a nurse or a secretary. So she remembered meeting my father. She wrote to him saying, was there any way he could enable her to buy a Riley 9 and enter rallies? So he took her to a London solicitor, and the three of them found a way to break what the uncle thought
The
was,
inheritance.
yeah. So she
Amazing.
got a Riley 9. She started entering Riley Motor Club rallies. She started winning them, and she progressed. She then became noticed by Rupert Riley, the Riley Racing Team manager.
Right.
He decided he'd take a gamble on her. The works management were incredulous. They said, you can't take a young girl and put her into the racing team. You know, she's never been on a racetrack in her life. She's only driven in some rallies. All right, she's won them. But he thought he spotted in her the ability. So into the team she comes in 1933, the Alpine Trial, and then 1934 into the Le Mans team
With Kay Peter.
with Kay Peter.
But before that, she'd raced at the Ulster Motor Rally, the Scottish Rally, and of course, as you said, the Alpine Cup,
Yeah.
and the Rally Monte Carlo.
Yeah, she won cups in all of those.
Did she win the Coupe de Dame or?
Yeah, Coupe de Dame, she
Coupe
won
de-
it in the Alpine Trial. Yes, yeah. And so Rupert Riley felt quietly confident. So they go out to Le Mans 2 weeks before the race so that they could do lots of practicing. He was worried about my mother hitting the mist, which traditionally hung along at the end of the Mulsanne Strait.
Uh-huh.
And so he had her woken up at 1 o'clock in the morning for 2 weeks every night, put
practice.
in the track from 1 a.m. to 3 a.m., hitting that mist night after night, so that in the race it didn't come as a shock to her to hit that mist at 80, 90 miles an hour.
Amazing.
And so she came 13th. She was very upset because at the start of the race, my father hadn't arrived, and I suppose she was distracted. They had to run across the tarmac, jump in the car. She did that, closed the imp, that was the model she was driving with the 9 engine, on her doors, on her fingers.
Oh,
So the end of the first hour, she was 43rd, last. Blood all over the cockpit. So she comes into the pits and they go to work on cleaning the cockpit, giving her new gloves, new shoes, a new top. And then my father arrives, gives her a sprig of heather, off she goes. And as night fell, she'd climbed from 43rd to 13th. The pits told her to stop and stay there for the night. She was very upset and said, I think I can go higher than 13th. You're to stay where you are. We've got 6 cars now in the first 13. There's never been anything like this.
that's right. You had
so
there was
2nd, 3rd, 5th, 9th, 11th, 13th.
yeah.
And so they said to my mother, you stay where you are. And she said, you know, I was so upset. So that's why I entered for 1935. I thought, I'll show you, I can do better than 13th. But of course, that wasn't to be.
Now, why wasn't that to be? Because I heard that she had started the practice, but then she was ill. But you told me a little bit earlier that she automatically got entered for 1935 Le Mans.
Well, she entered herself as soon as the race ended in 34. She put her entry down.
But then what happened?
But then when they married, my father laid down no more motorsport. And that upset her, but in those days she had to agree. And so she didn't do any more motorsport after that.
And then what was you saying about the ERA though?
Yes, well, what happened, Raymond Mays was developing the ERA, which was based on a Riley engine. And when the prototype ERA was finished, he rang my mother. A lot of people say he had a soft spot for her, and said, would you like to come over to Bourne in Lincolnshire and try out the prototype ERA? So she said, off I went. And of course, father gets home from Coventry at about 7 in the evening. Dorothy, Dorothy, no answer. And it was 10 o'clock that night before she got home. Of course, he went absolutely mad with her. And of course, she said to me, with the vibration, I suppose it's possible you might have been born in an ERA, because I was heavily pregnant. But you weren't, but you. That was.
And how did the testing go with the ERA?
Very, very well. And of course, that also became an enormous success based on the Riley engine.
But she didn't race anymore,
No,
especially after you were born and your
Yeah.
sister was born.
Yes.
So
yes.
she didn't race at all?
No.
Was she involved with cars still?
Only in terms of going to Riley Motor Club events with my father. I mean, I had quite a poignant situation many years later, probably around 1990. I had a phone call from Margaret Allen, who invited me to come and see her down on the South Wales coast in Carmarthenshire, where she lived with her husband, although he had died by the time I went down. And it was like going into a time warp. She'd still got 1930s telegraphs littered around the lounge. And she poured her heart out to me and said, your mother could have got a gold star at Brooklands like I did. Only 2 women got a gold star at Brooklands, but she said, your mother could have done it. I know she could, but your father stopped it. But so she talked a lot about my mother that day.
Because she had some great success with her rallies, didn't she?
She won the Scottish. She won at rallies galore.
She went to the Monte Carlo from Sweden.
Yes, that's right.
Why not weren't they doing it from Johnny Groves that year?
Yeah, she did the previous year. Then the following year, she decided with 2 other young ladies, they'd start from Umeå in Sweden in deep snow. How the 3 of them got into a Riley 9.
3 of them in one car?
In one little Riley 9. I mean, I guess they only had room for a toothbrush as well as the 3 bodies. But anyway, they had to dig themselves out of snow again and again coming down through Sweden.
They finished in 58, which is really good for
Yes,
rally.
and then they got a ladies' prize, which Prince Rainier presented her with. Yes. Yeah.
My goodness.
Yeah.
So we have to wrap up. I've just looked at the time. Oh my goodness, we have to really wrap up.
Yeah.
I could talk to you all day about
your
your father and your mother.
Yes.
So your father retired, I suppose, when did he retire?
He retired in 1947.
Yeah.
Lord Nuffield said to him one day, look, you're 71.
Yeah.
I think it's time you retired and went fly fishing. That was my father's great hobby, fly fishing. So, and he was very upset. But Lord Nuffield said, look, you've got to make way for younger people. You've done your bit.
And talking about younger people, there's you that came along. What's your childhood memories of growing up with such an industrious and engineering and trailblazing family?
My first recollection is just before World War II, probably when I was 4 years old. My father sitting me on his lap in his Riley Adelphi, putting my hand on the steering wheel, and then he operated the pedals. And of course, in the Cotswolds in the 1930s, there was never a soul about. And he said to me, that was your first driving experience, which I can just vaguely remember. I can remember listening to Chamberlain saying we're at war in 1939.
Yeah.
And I can remember my father, we were on holiday in Bournemouth. I can remember my father packing a case, jumping in his Riley and disappearing within an hour of Chamberlain's announcement, going straight to the works, as opposed to start preparing for a complete change in production and going into munitions from cars. That's another memory. There's a lovely story in the early part of the war. My father applied for petrol coupons, and the Home Office told him to get a train to Coventry from Stow-on-the-Wold. So my father researched it, and he sent them a long letter saying, if I leave at 7 in the morning, I can be in the works canteen for lunchtime. If I leave straight after lunch, I can be back home for 7 o'clock at night. Within days, coupons arrived.
Came in because he was making the ammunition.
I always remember that. I thought that was hilarious.
We have to wrap up. I really could talk to you for a long, long time, but Victor, I think everyone listening and watching would love to know more. And the Riley Archive, the Riley Trust Archive, is open to the public by appointment. It's in the Coventry Basin.
Yes.
Coventry Canal Basin.
Yes.
And I think everyone should come here because it's basically the British motoring industry in one room. It's just so fascinating. And I have to thank you so much for spending time with me. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I look forward to part 2 when you're ready.
I think we need to do a part 2, don't we? We really do. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Right. Yeah. And thank you, Brian, for opening up. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Right, I'm going to stop the recording here and see what we've got, eh? Thank you so much.
Right.